Thank you for joining us for Radford Reads with Dr. Matthew Raidbard at Radford Public Library. Dr. Raidbard received his Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Classical Studies. With the dream of becoming a college basketball coach, he pursued his passion and landed his first coaching position as an assistant men's basketball coach at Western New Mexico University. While working in this new position, Dr. Matthew Raidbard also earned his Master of Arts degree in Educational Leadership. His career from there took him to other men's basketball coaching opportunities at Dartmouth College and Florida Gulf Coast University, and then to Chicago State University. He then completed his doctorate in educational leadership while working at Chicago State. He also conducted research and accomplished his dissertation, which focused on determining the best leadership style and behaviors for athletic coaches to practice. He has worked over a decade as a college basketball coach. His experience as a coach has led him to the realization that athletic coaching is an act of leadership, yet coaches don't routinely receive support or training in this specific aspect. Lead Like a Pro was written with the goal to help coaches expand their leadership knowledge base and be able to make more intentional choices about the leadership style and behaviors they choose to practice. Here's a cover of the book. And thank you again, Dr. Raidbard, for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to you and turn off my camera. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the library. I really appreciate the opportunity to present tonight. For me, my dream was always to be a college basketball coach. But leadership is something that really kind of coincided with the beginning of my basketball journey. And I always like to start off whenever I'm speaking to groups or doing any presentations or trainings with a story about how I got into coaching, but also how I got into leadership. And, when I was getting ready to graduate from Indiana University, I decided that was the best time to pursue my dream of being a college basketball coach. And I wasn't a college athlete. I didn't know anybody or have any family members in coaching. So I just started emailing and calling and applying for jobs. And I got really fortunate to get my first job as a coach at Western New Mexico University, a really small Division II school down in the southwest corner of New Mexico. But contingent on me accepting the job, I had to be enrolled in graduate school. And I really didn't have any interest in graduate school at the time. I was just solely focused on coaching. But if I needed to be enrolled in order to accept the position, then I was going to do whatever it took. So I quickly, took the GREs and sent my transcripts and applied and did everything that I needed to do. And I was very fortunate to be accepted into the program and be able to take the job. And, when I went down to Silver City, I remember on my first day, my head coach walked me around and he set me up in my office. He introduced me to everybody. And then after lunch, I went to go meet with my academic advisor. And when I got there, the first thing she told me was that based on my undergraduate degree in history and classical studies, which isn't particularly applicable to coaching, she said there were only two programs that I could realistically get into and complete. One was counseling and one was educational leadership. And I really didn't care which one I did. So we put the two programs side by side and we just went through the pros and cons of both. And as we went through them, I could see how both would be applicable to what I was trying to do or what I was going to be doing in coaching. And I really didn't know which one to decide. And then when we finally got to the end of kind of looking at both different majors, we got the timeline to graduation. And the education leadership timeline to graduation was 4 semesters, 2 falls, 2 springs, and graduation. And the counseling timeline to graduation was exactly the same, except it also required an additional 6-hour summer internship. So based on that reason, I chose educational leadership. And I had no idea the impact that decision would have on not only my future in coaching, but also my professional life, eventually going back to school, pursuing a doctorate, writing the book, and now, working in administration and working to help coaches really enhance their leadership practice, be more thoughtful and intentional leaders. Like we said in the introduction, I've spent my entire professional career as a college basketball coach and administrator. My background is in educational leadership. And really what I do focuses on the main central thesis, and it's really the central thesis of the book, that coaches are leaders. And what I hear from a lot of coaches at different levels of sports is this idea that, college coaches are leaders or professional coaches are leaders. If it's your full-time job, then you're a leader. But if you're a high school coach who's also a teacher, if you're a youth sports coach, rec coach, if you're coaching your son or daughter's team for a few hours a week, that you're a leader, but it's different. And what I tell all coaches at all levels of sports is that you are a leader, regardless of whether it's your full-time job, regardless of how many hours you put into it every week, regardless of whether you're a volunteer, you are a leader. And all of the decisions that you make for your team, for your kids, are leadership decisions. And that's the other big thing I get from a lot of coaches. And I get this a lot from college coaches. This idea that, the really big decisions, the decisions you make about who plays at the end of the game or what play you run with the game on the line, what you emphasize at practice, what your game plan is, those are leadership decisions. But all the other little decisions, they're different. They're not really leadership decisions in the same way. And while those are big, important leadership decisions that could have very direct or dramatic impact on outcomes in the moment, all of the decisions that coaches make, no matter how big or small or seemingly inconsequential you might think they are at the time, all of those decisions are leadership decisions. It's not just about those big plays that can affect winning and losing. It's how you communicate with your athletes, how you give them praise, how you give them corrections that ultimately can have a big impact over time, can have a big cumulative effect. How much buy-in you get from your athletes could depend on whether you allow them to have a lot of input or whether you make more decisions more unilaterally. All of these things are leadership decisions, and even small decisions cumulatively can have a really big impact on outcomes, and not just winning and losing, but how great of an experience or not your kids have as being part of the team, whether or not they feel really good about their place in the team and want to come back, whether you build a really strong, positive team culture or not. So all these decisions, I want coaches to view through a leadership lens and be really intentional about them, because ultimately they are going to affect all the various outcomes that you're trying to achieve as a coach. And that's why coaches need leadership education and training. Coaches at all levels of sports are asked to take on more roles, serve and more leadership responsibilities than ever before. When I took my first job at Western Mexico University, I remember I was living in Chicago at the time, and I drove, it's about 1,600 miles. It took me 24 hours to drive from Chicago to Silver City. And the whole ride, I was thinking to myself, this is so amazing. I'm going to live my dream. I'm going to be a college basketball coach, and I'm going to spend all of my time recruiting, coaching on the floor at practice, doing workouts, game planning, breaking down film. Those are going to be my primary job responsibilities. And I'll never forget, I was down in Silver City for about a month, and I was talking to my dad, and he asked me how everything was going. And I told him everything was going great. I love my coach, the players, I love the city, the community, the university. But I just didn't understand when I was going to get the opportunity to focus on all those very basketball specific responsibilities that I thought were going to be so central to my job. I was spending an outsized amount of time on a lot of other leadership responsibilities. I was a mentor, a friend, a confidant, a chauffeur, a nutritionist, a strength and conditioning coach, a class checker, a study hall monitor. I was doing all of these other things that require very different leadership approach and leadership practice than coaching on the floor. How I provided my athletes feedback on the court, how I communicated with them on the court or about basketball, I felt very confident in my leadership practice. I felt like I had very strong instincts as to how I wanted to communicate, how I wanted to present myself, how I wanted to build relationships. But when it came to, a student athlete who had a problem in class and I needed to help them work through it, or they weren't showing up to class and I needed to have a difficult discussion with them, I didn't have the tools in my leadership practice, in my leadership toolbox, to be able to take on all of those roles in a confident way, to be able to meet all of the needs of my athletes. And the effect of that for coaches is, the influence coaches have, because they wear all these different hats, because they have all these different leadership roles, is that they're in a position or there's a lot of opportunities for them to positively or negatively impact their athletes. How I communicate on the court, corrections or praise, is going to have an impact on my athletes. So I need to feel confident in the way I'm leading, the way I'm acting, that I'm doing it in a way that's representative of me. How I communicate with my athlete that I'm unhappy with them about how they're treating their classes, or how I'm giving them support because they're struggling in an element of their life. Again, that could positively or negatively affect them. It's going to have an impact on our relationship that ultimately, you can't completely disconnect from their role as, both an athlete and as just a student or a human being. So, coaches need to be able to have the leadership practice and the leadership tools to be able to take on all of these different roles, so they can best serve the needs of their athletes in all of these different areas. So, one thing that was a big inspiration for the book, that is a very common kind of problem for coaches. It definitely was for me when I was first starting out in coaching. Happens to a lot of young coaches, new coaches that are experiencing ups and downs or feel like they've hit a plateau. Oftentimes, the kind of culprit for that is a gap that exists between their, what I call, perceived and actual leadership. But what it essentially comes down to is there's a gap between the type of leader the coach wants to be and the type of leader they actually are. And fundamentally, that comes down to two things. One can be a lack of leadership knowledge. So, a coach kind of believing that they're practicing one leadership style, but not having all of the background and knowledge to know exactly what that leadership style is. Or it comes down to, and this is more common, not having the tools to practice the leadership style that they want to. That was what happened to me early in my career. When I enrolled in graduate school, started learning about leadership practice, I naturally gravitated towards transformational leadership. It aligned with a lot of the kind of character traits or core values as a leader that came very natural to me. I'm a very positive person. I believe in clear, direct communication. I believe it's my job as a coach to inspire and motivate my athletes to believe they can achieve more or be more than they thought they could on their own. I really got into coaching because I wanted to build strong relationships with my athletes, have a positive impact on their lives and their learning, growth, and development. So knowing those things about myself, once I started learning about transformational leadership, I had a light bulb, went off in my head. I had an epiphany that, foundationally, I'm a transformational leader. The problem that I had was early on in my career was I didn't know how to practice transformational leadership in a very intentional way. So one mistake I made early on was I went out and I decided I'm going to be inspirational and motivational to all my athletes. Everybody's going to get the same amount of inspiration and motivation. And the problem with that was that I had very inconsistent results. I had some athletes who took the inspiration and motivation that I was giving them, and they immediately started achieving short-term goals. And I had other athletes who took the inspiration and motivation I gave them and started making progress, and then maybe they got discouraged or they hit a plateau. And it took me a little while to understand that, a central tool that I was missing in practicing transformational leadership was that I needed to adjust my leadership practice, not change who I was as a leader, adjust my leadership practice to meet the needs of every individual athlete. So there were some athletes that needed more inspiration and motivation, needed more coaching, needed more individualized consideration or attention. I needed to be able to adjust my practice to give that to them so that they had the same opportunity to accomplish short-term goals, make progress on long-term goals as the other athletes did who didn't need as much inspiration and motivation. So, we'll kind of go through a few different things here, and it's kind of the process I call, kind of creating your leadership style, kind of creating your leadership plan. And it starts with determining what's the right leadership style for you. This is the kind of 3 steps that I walk through in the book that, I believe are central to coaches determining what the right leadership style is for them. And it starts with determining what are your personal values and beliefs as a leader. For me, when I reflected on that early in my career, when I looked at what came instinctually to me as a leader, kind of what I really valued about my role as a coach and a leader, I was immediately drawn to some of those behaviors I talked about earlier, that transformational style of inspiration and motivation, direct communication, building relationships, allowing my athletes to have input in a conversation so that I could create buy-in and again, build relationships. Knowing those about myself, reflecting on them, identifying those as my core leadership values. Once I learned foundational leadership knowledge, I was able to identify that the foundation of my leadership practice was transformational leadership, but I also pulled in elements of other leadership styles like democratic leadership and servant leadership that comprise my unique practice. At that point, I needed to acquire the tools to be able to go out and practice my leadership style in a way that was intentional and meaningful. And that's kind of the 3 steps that we're going to have to talk through tonight during this presentation. It's going to help you start thinking about, what's the foundation of your leadership practice? What are those core values? What leadership styles they align with? And then, here's some tools that you could use to go out and practice it. So, before we kind of dive into all of that, what I want to just kind of state up front, and I talk about this a lot in the book, and I think it's really important, and it kind of layers on top of the idea that coaches are leaders, is that every leader is different and every leadership style is unique. And one mistake that I made early in my career that a lot of young or new coaches make is they believe that the kind of key to leadership, key to being a successful leader, is to watch what other great coaches are doing or watch what their mentors are doing and then kind of mimic that or use that as the basis of their leadership practice. I did that early on and I got very inconsistent results. And I would realize, later on that the reason for that is that, a big part of what makes great coaches great, what makes successful leaders successful, is that they've figured out what leadership style or styles best align with their personal values and beliefs, and then they've learned how to practice it. But ultimately, that's not necessarily going to be right for me or for anyone else. And, if I just decide I'm going to mimic what they're doing, even if we're both transformational leaders, even if our leadership styles are very, very closely aligned, it's still going to look and feel different. We communicate different. We have different personalities. We have different kind of other outside values that are going to trickle into our leadership practice, different things going on in our lives. So ultimately, there's no way to copy anybody else's leadership style. And what's important is that you determine what's the best leadership style for you and not necessarily kind of look to what other people are doing as a way to kind of build your leadership practice. While it is important to always be looking at different resources and see what other people are doing, because you may want to incorporate them into your practice, still at the core of it, I just want everybody to maintain that leadership practice that's uniquely theirs. And ultimately, your leadership practice is going to be built on a foundation of 1 or 2 leadership styles, or maybe it's going to be several different leadership styles. Like I said, I was mostly drawn to transformational leadership, but I also practice elements of democratic and servant leadership. You might find as we go through this that you see yourself in 4 different leadership styles equally. That's totally fine. That's all what makes up your unique leadership practice, because ultimately nobody practices only one leadership style. I might practice all the core elements of transformational leadership, but when it comes to decision making, I kind of lean towards democratic leadership over autocratic leadership. I might lean towards servant leadership when I'm kind of putting the needs of my athletes first. So, while it is common to have a kind of core leadership style, nobody's only going to have one leadership style, and I think that's what's so important is that, really leadership is just about figuring out what works for you. So all this comes down to giving coaches the ability to make intentional leadership choices. And what that means is, kind of starting off by asking yourself these questions and others to try to determine what are your leadership goals? What are your goals for your team and your athletes? What's important to you as a leader? What are your responsibilities as a leader? What do your athletes need from you? What are your goals? These questions and the answers that you have to them are ultimately going to set it up so that we can build your leadership practice in an intentional way, so that your leadership decisions are moving you towards getting these answers or any others that you have. So for example, if your goal for the team is to have fun, Knowing that as the leader, now you can make intentional leadership choices based on your leadership practice to help your kids have fun. So, that might mean for me, since I'm, really focused on positivity and building relationships and inspiration and motivation, that might mean that, when every kid comes to practice every time, I get there early and I say hello and give a high five to every one of them, try to make them feel special. That might mean that I give corrections one-on-one whenever possible instead of a group. That might mean that I use any other tool to try to help my kids have a lot of fun. I end practice every time with a game, so everybody leaves feeling good about themselves and happy. Those are all the tools that I'm using as a transformational leader to try to, move my team, move my kids towards the accomplishment of these goals. So in the next part of the presentation, I'm going to talk through some different leadership styles. And, we'll start off with transformational leadership, which is a really important leadership style to me. It's also the leadership style that is most commonly practiced by coaches. If you, kind of listen to me talk about transformational leadership and the key behaviors, and it doesn't really speak to you, that's totally fine. Not everybody is a transformational leader. Not everybody even practices elements of transformational leadership. But it is a very commonly practiced leadership style. And part of the reason for that is it's the leadership style that has been shown over time that athletes respond to the best. And that kind of makes sense because it's based on inspiration and motivation, based on building relationships, positivity. And it's human nature that those are aspects that a lot of people are drawn to. Again, though, if you're not feeling transformational leadership, that's totally fine. This is all just a menu for you to choose from. Figure out what styles and behaviors speak to you and your core values, and that's how we'll build your leadership practice. But transformational leadership at its core is about inspiration and motivation. And there's different ways that coaches can do that. Obviously one way is using positive, motivational and uplifting, inspirational communication. But there are other tools that you could use to do that as a transformation leader. You could work to build up the confidence of your athletes. You could model hard work, determination as behaviors for your athletes so that you might not be telling them, I want you to work hard, but you could be showing them through your actions. I know for me, when I see people around me or my mentors working hard or being very determined, that motivates me. That inspires me to want to work hard and be determined. So that's a really powerful tool that transformational leaders can use to inspire and motivate. It's also, another tool is working to instill a sense of purpose in your athletes. As coaches, don't take for granted that all of your athletes, just because they're on the team, they feel a sense of purpose. As part of your job as a transformational leader is making sure that you instill that sense of purpose in your athletes. It's also about having clear, positive, and direct communication. And that doesn't mean, I think a misconception about transformational leaders is that they're always positive, that they don't really provide criticisms or corrections. Everything is very positive and flowery language. And that's not true. It's about the approach. The approach is very clear and direct. And for me, that meant giving a lot of one-on-one feedback. That was the tool I used as a transformational leader. I found my athletes responded better to one-on-one corrections than me yelling them across the court or the field in front of their peers. They just accepted it a lot better and they felt a lot more supported. It's also about working to enhance the strengths of your athletes while masking their weaknesses. That's I think something that's central to a lot of coaches' practices. How can we highlight your strengths? But I want to make sure coaches don't forget that at the same time, don't just hide your athletes' weaknesses or kind of move away from them. Help them work to turn them into strengths at the same time. And then transformational leadership is also about showing strong support for your athletes, taking an optimistic approach to their success, displaying a lot of enthusiasm. One tool that I used, for this as a transformation leader was I use the word we whenever possible. We're going to do this. We can figure this out. We can overcome this. We're going to get through this. I felt that we really instilled a sense of community with my athletes, built a really strong bond and relationship because they knew I was invested and I supported them. I was optimistic and enthusiastic that we're going to get through this. I wasn't just giving them corrections and kind of leaving them on an island to go make those changes. So the next leadership style I'll talk about is servant leadership. And just me personally, I believe that everybody who makes the decision to be a coach is, at least in some small respect, practicing servant leadership. Because at the core or the foundation of servant leadership is putting the needs of others above your own, above everything else. And to me, if you make the decision to be a coach, inherent in that decision is you putting the needs of others first. Because the primary job of a coach before anything else is to build a team through learning, growth, and development of individual athletes so that the sum becomes greater than the parts. And in order to do that, you have to be invested in helping others. You have to be invested in helping others improve, others come together. There's a lot of other jobs that coaches could take on that put their needs first or put their needs more towards the forefront. But inherently in being a coach, you are giving up your time to help others be better. And that's a very servant leader quality and trait. Servant leadership is also about modeling really great behaviors: unselfishness, empathy, inclusion, teamwork, listening. And one that I particularly want to highlight is inclusion. Again, just like with instilling a sense of purpose, don't take for granted that all of your athletes, just because they're on the team, feel included. Sometimes in coaching, we talk about it as defining everybody's role. Even that, don't take for granted that everybody knows their role, right? As a coach, it's your job to make sure that everybody comes together, that everybody on the team understands that there's a role for all of them to play, and everybody's role is important, and that we cannot achieve our greatest as a team without everybody playing their role as well as they can, whether that's the quarterback or the leading scorer, or whether that's an athlete who doesn't play very much. I always used to make sure that my athletes who weren't playing very much, I always tried to make sure that they understood the importance of being a really great teammate, encouraging your teammates, being really focused and watching the game, providing your teammates with insight, things that you see, making sure that they were engaged and included in the process of playing a game, even though they weren't on the court. And then the last really key element of servant leadership is working to enhance the leadership abilities of all team members. And this is one I think gets lost a lot on coaches. It took me a long time in my coaching career to realize the importance of enhancing the leadership abilities of everybody on the team. I think it's very natural for coaches to always be the leader or always fill the leadership vacuum. I mean, it makes sense. We're coaches. If we see something that's great, we immediately want to praise it. If we see something that's incorrect, we immediately want to correct it. But one thing that can happen as the coach when you're always filling that leadership vacuum is that it doesn't leave a lot of opportunities for your athletes to take on a leadership role because you're always there. They always see you in that role, or they expect you to be in that role. And they might take a more passive role to leadership. So what I encourage coaches to do, and I really, if servant leadership is leadership style that's speaking to you, I really encourage you to do this with your team, which is, next time you're at practice, when you see something that's really great happen, give it a second. Don't immediately praise it. Give some space for your athletes to fill that vacuum with their leadership. Praising each other can be very powerful. It's huge for team chemistry. It's huge for team building and building a positive team culture. It's the same thing if you see a correction. Now, make sure that you're modeling the way that you want your athletes to give each other corrections, because the first thing that they're most likely to do is look to how you provide corrections when talking to each other. So make sure you're modeling it in the way that you would want them to do it. And make sure that when they start doing it to each other, that it's constructive. But it can be very powerful for your team when athletes feel comfortable stepping in that leadership role and correcting each other. Especially, when you're in a game, team sports, things are happening very quickly. All of that leadership ability that you've built up in your teams is going to be so central to winning and losing, having a great experience, overcoming adversity. So I really encourage you to think about working to enhance the leadership abilities of all team members. So the next leadership styles we'll talk about are really opposite leadership styles, democratic versus autocratic leadership. And, democratic leadership to start with is, really it's a leadership style that's a lot how it sounds. It's about working to solicit, listen to, consider the opinions of all team members before you make team decisions. What this does is it builds a really strong culture. There's a lot of mutual trust and respect there. You're showing a lot of respect and trust for your athletes' opinions by allowing them to have a voice in determining team decisions. And there's that can engender a lot of buy-in from your athletes because they have that voice in team decisions. What I will say is that while democratic leadership is a representative democracy, that in terms of everybody having the opportunity to have a voice in decision making, it's not a voting democracy, or it's not necessarily a voting democracy. And just be very careful if you want to make it a voting democracy. If you kind of take a straw poll of everybody's decisions and the team comes down 10-9 and you're in the 9, that doesn't mean you should just unilaterally change what your decision was just because the slight majority felt a different way. At the end of the day, you are the coach. You're responsible for making team decisions and you're responsible for their outcomes. And if you make a decision, you have to be comfortable with it. You have to believe in it. Otherwise, you risk sabotaging it before it's even had a chance to play out. You risk undermining your own decision if you don't really believe in it. Now, if you take a straw poll of that same group and it comes down 17-2 and you're in the 2, I still would never tell coaches to unilaterally change their decision. But I would say in that case, I would encourage you, run that decision by a friend, a mentor, a colleague, another coach that you trust. Make sure you're looking at it from all the right angles and that you really feel good about your decision. And if you decide to change, that's totally fine. But if you decide to go with your decision in that scenario, just so that you can keep your buy-in, you may want to consider being very transparent about why you're sticking with that decision when it's such a minority opinion. When it's 10-9, 11-8, generally the team is going to see, well, okay, it was pretty much a split decision. Coach has got to go on one side or the other, but coach, listen to me. If it's a majority on one side and you're in the minority and you're sticking with that minority decision, I really think it behooves you to be transparent with your athletes and your team members about why you're making that decision. Because ultimately you don't want to lose your buy-in because you've stuck with a minority decision, even though you allowed everybody to have input. And just like every leadership style, there are potential unintended consequences or drawbacks. And one thing with democratic leadership is, because you're getting the opinions of all team members before making team decisions, it can be a very slow and deliberative process, which for coaches can make it sometimes difficult to practice. For me, I definitely was more of a democratic leader. I like to get my athletes' input on different decisions, not all of them, but a lot of them. But ultimately, as the coach, there are certain situations I didn't have time to ask their opinions. There was too much pressure to ask their opinions, too much stress. And I had to just make decisions in a more autocratic way, the next leadership style that we'll discuss. So, when those decisions would arise, I oftentimes felt like, again, I needed to be more transparent about why I did that, so I didn't lose buy-in or have my athletes think that I was all of a sudden changing my leadership approach from democratic to autocratic. Because in autocratic leadership, you're limiting the input from team members. You're making the decisions with very little to no input from anybody else. And ultimately, what that creates is a highly structured team environment or a hierarchy where, maybe you get a little bit of input from your assistant coaches or a little bit of input from maybe a team captain, but ultimately you're very limited in who you allow to influence your team decisions or potentially influence your team decisions. And while autocratic leadership can feel very negative or kind of scary to embrace for a lot of coaches, I completely understand that. When you think about it, to take autocratic down to its core, as a coach, you're hired to make team decisions. And like we said, you're responsible for their outcomes. So I think it's very natural that a lot of coaches would want to make those decisions based on their knowledge and experience, as opposed to getting a lot of input maybe from their team members, particularly if it's a younger group or a new team, or just a team they don't feel like has really built up a lot of leadership abilities yet. It makes sense that a coach would want to unilaterally make those decisions. Also, coaches have a lot of stress and pressure at all levels of sports. There's a lot of competing, agendas that are going on. In youth sports, you've got parents, you've got your kids, you've got other supporters. You're trying to work through a lot of things. Same thing with us at the college level that we were trying to figure out. And it makes sense that you'd want to rely on your experience, your knowledge, your instincts to make team decisions. As a drawback to this, what could happen is you might not have a lot of buy-in, particularly at the beginning. A way that autocratic leaders get buy-in as opposed to democratic leaders is by making decisions and being able to demonstrate results or moving towards results. That's how you engender a lot of buy-in as an autocratic leader, by saying, look, maybe you don't have a lot of input into decisions, but I'm making decisions that are working. So trust me and buy into what I'm doing. And ultimately, that's a very powerful tool that autocratic leaders have. That again, whereas democratic leaders are making decisions based on a group, they ultimately fall on the coach, but some of that can go down to the group as well. Some of those, some of the blowback or consequences if decisions don't work. If a decision works and you're an autocratic leader, it rests on you. And the same thing if it doesn't work. So again, as an autocratic leader, know that it's probably going to take a little time to get that buy-in from your athletes, but by making decisions that are working and building that trust, you could still achieve really great buy-in as an autocratic leader. And then the last leadership style that I'll talk about is transactional leadership. It's definitely a leadership style that I'm sure everybody listening or watching this, once you start hearing me explain it, you're going to have flashbacks to a coach or a number of coaches who practiced elements of transactional leadership. It's not as commonly practiced now, but I do still believe that practiced in the right way, practiced intermittently, and focusing on achieving short-term goals, that transactional leadership can still be an effective leadership style. It's about setting clear standards and expectations up front, which I think a lot of coaches still believe in. Team rules and expectations at the first meeting comes up a lot. That's rooted in transactional leadership. But at its core, it's based on a contingent rewards or punishment system. So, the example I like to give is, if you're for me as a basketball coach, I've been working over a series of weeks for our team to improve their shooting, and we've hit a plateau, and I've tried everything. So now I decided I'm going to set up a contingent rewards and punishment system to try to motivate my athletes. And so I set up a drill. I set up a series of drills. And the first drill is I want my team to make 100 shots in 5 minutes. And if we make 100 shots in 5 minutes, we get a water break and we move on to the next drill. If we don't make 100 shots in 5 minutes, we have to run to the end of the court and back. We don't get a water break and we have to do the drill again. The idea being that the reward will be a motivator so that my athletes will work harder and be more focused to accomplish that short-term goal, or that the punishment will be a deterrent from them being unfocused or maybe slacking off a little bit, and that they'll then be motivated to want to achieve that short-term goal to avoid the punishment. I believe that, transactional leadership, when focusing on the rewards aspect, because kids, athletes, they respond much better to the opportunity for reward than the threat of a punishment. So when focusing on the rewards aspect and also tying in another leadership style like transformational leadership, transactional leadership can be a powerful tool for accomplishing short-term goals to try to get you over the hump. When practicing transactional leadership, mixing in some transformational leadership, really showing your kids that you're trying to inspire and motivate them, that you want them to achieve that reward, can be a very powerful motivator when paired with transactional leadership. So in the last part of the presentation, I'm just going to talk a little bit about, a question that I get a lot, and then I ask myself a lot as a leader, and it's, how do I know if my leadership style is working? And ultimately, I just draw you back to the questions and the answers we talked about at the beginning. Those questions you asked yourselves and the answers that you came up with, which are your goals or your outcomes, at the end of the season or at a certain point in the season when you're assessing your leadership practice and the progress you're making, are you accomplishing those goals? At the end of the year, when I kind of survey, how things went, when I look at my kids, when I get their feedback, did they have fun? Did everybody or a lot of kids leave practice every day feeling excited, feeling like they had a good experience? Were they excited to come back to practice the next time? Were they feeling really good about themselves? Did we have good relationships? Did a lot of them sign up to come back the following year or season? Those are all indicators that you could use to see if you accomplished those goals. And if you did, then you can look back on those intentional leadership decisions that you made and say, you know what? That was a great choice for me to show up early and greet everybody one-on-one before practice started, or to play a game at the end of practice so that everybody left on a high note, or to really focus on getting to know my athletes on a personal level so they felt supported. And you could assess those specific leadership behaviors that you enacted during the season, those intentional leadership decisions, to see if they worked, getting you towards those outcomes. And if they didn't, that's okay. Ultimately, it's about the leadership process, the leadership journey. It's not always about the outcomes. Outcomes are an indicator. And certainly we want to look at outcomes to determine if we think we're practicing the right leadership behaviors. But I'll say this, there are a lot of times I look back on my career and I believe I made all the right leadership decisions. I practiced the right leadership behaviors. I wouldn't change a thing. And I did not get the outcomes that I wanted. And there are plenty of other times when I look back on my career and I look at times when I made terrible leadership decisions that compromised my core values and beliefs, and I got the outcome that I wanted. Ultimately, what I want for coaches, what I encourage coaches is, let's focus on the former. We want to make really great leadership decisions that hopefully move us towards the accomplishment of goals. But if they don't, that's okay. That's the leadership journey. You didn't fail as a leader if you went through all those different leadership behaviors and not all of your kids had fun. Let's assess. Let's try to figure out what else we can do, what changes we can make so that more of your kids have more fun next time. That's the leadership journey. Because no leader practices all the best leadership behaviors and the perfect leadership style all the time. And no leader is ever going to get to the end of the season and say that 100% of their kids had fun 100% of the time, right? There are plenty of times when, I got to the end of the year and had a number of kids leave. And I needed to assess all of those individual cases to see, what, was it something I did? Were there other factors? They weren't playing a lot. They didn't like the campus life. They wanted something different. Those are things I can't control through my leadership practice. But just because that athlete was leaving doesn't mean that I failed. But then there are other times when, we just didn't have a great relationship. The athlete just didn't feel supported enough. That's when I need to look back at my leadership decisions and say, this athlete, when I look back at the signs, I needed to be more supportive. I needed to be more empathetic. I needed to listen better. I needed to work to build more of a relationship with them. My communication wasn't great. I didn't meet their needs. And there's things that I need to change for when I have another athlete in that similar situation. Because ultimately your leadership journey is going to be filled with successes and failures, ups and downs. But the defining part of your leadership journey is not how many successes you had or how many failures, but that you cared enough about your athletes and your team to keep trying to be a better leader. Because ultimately, to me, a perfect leader is somebody who cares enough about their athletes, about their team, to keep trying to be a better leader, keep improving their leadership practice, to keep trying to meet the needs of their athletes. Ultimately, that's what coaching is all about. So my book is Lead Like a Pro, Effective Leadership Styles for Athletic Coaches. It's available on Amazon and wherever you get your books. I really appreciate everybody coming on and joining us here. And thanks so much to the library for having me.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it. All right, we do have a copy of Lead Like a Pro at the Radford Public Library. So for all of you who are watching, please know that you can come by and check it out. And again, Dr. Matthew Raidbard, thank you so much for being here and doing this for us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
All right, take care.